Great. Hello. Welcome. How's it going today? I have successfully figured out live streaming. Mission accomplished, eh? How's everyone's day going? I hope well. I'm going to mute my computer over here because I'm hearing myself in the really awkward, like 15-second slap back. What a beautiful day, all. Hi. Welcome to this, which is the first inaugural installment of Chat with Chet. If you don't know me, my name's Chet, if it wasn't painfully obvious from the mildly self-centered name of the show. Basically, welcome to Quarantine 2020. I assume this will be a recurring event for the next few years. So for this year, my plan is to kind of just teach some classes and give us a foundation in various things that I do in my life. So to begin with today, we're going to dive into disguise and video playback, essentially. One moment while I check the chat. Oh, great. Everything seems to be working thus far, which is wonderful. So, as far as disguise goes, you may wonder, why am I teaching a class in disguise? Do I know what I'm talking about? The proper response to that is no, actually, but we're going to carry on still. I am the former support and training specialist for the Disguise New York office. So I've given the Disguise fundamentals and advanced trainings something like 100 times. I stopped counting after 50, which I kind of regret because it was really great just to go back every couple months and say, oh, look, I did that another dozen times or so. So let's go ahead and let's begin at the start, shall we? So you should see my web browser now. We're going to go ahead and start out by going to disguise.one. This is the Disguise website. If you don't have a trial, you can get a trial here. I suggest not going through this process right now because we're going to be able to review this again later on. Basically, I'm just going to give you an idea of what the various pieces of the software do, introduction to it. Unfortunately, for those of us following along on Mac, Disguise is Windows only. If you need help boot camping, I once did it through the course of a show run, which I was very proud of and probably should not have done, but desperate times call for desperate measures. One other website that's worth calling out is the Disguise help site at help.disguise.one. Now, this is Disguise's online user guide, which has various pieces. What is Disguise, system requirements, down to how layers, the timeline, workflows for Evo for those of us who want to do previs with lighting. Also, some very old tutorials, which are probably going to be changing soon because I think a lot of us have time to record videos. So, just good to help figure out where everything is going. I honestly still reference this every so often. Probably once or twice a training when I'm doing the more advanced trainings. Fundamentals, not as much unless there's a question that comes up that I can't answer. So if you have Disguise downloaded and installed, this is Disguise Manager, which we are going to right now. Disguise Manager is where all of your project files live. If I go ahead and open the project folder, we can see D3 Projects houses each of my various D3 project folders. Chat with Chat is what we'll be working in today. But these are various projects that I've been working on throughout the course of my time with the software. I've moved a bunch off. If you ever need to move this onto a new server or a new computer, just take that whole folder and bring it into its D3 projects folder. On the server, this lives in your D drive. There's a separate hard drive or RAID drive, depending on what model you're working with. Inside the folder itself, we have the project file, a history folder, which is auto-saving every 5 minutes when the playhead isn't moving. If I want to roll back from a history file, it's just a matter of copying it, pasting it into the root folder. I often will change the name because it's a very long, obnoxious name to work with, since it's the whole history tag of when it was saved. We also have our objects folder. This is where we'll place all objects that we're using. The really important ones for this are video file and mesh. Video file is where all of your videos are going to go. Note that still images like JPEGs, PNGs also will go into the same folder. As far as playback goes, there's a few main codecs that you're going to work with. For video file, I normally encode into HAP or into Notch LC, which is the new codec that Notch has released. For HAP, you can also use HAP Alpha or HAP Q. Disguise does not support HAP Q plus alpha, which is also sometimes referred to as HAP M, mainly because playing back a HAP M file is about equivalent to playing back an animation file, and at that point you might as well just play animation so you don't deal with any of the errors that you'll get through HAP. Notch LC is probably the prettiest codec if you have the headroom to run it. The problem is, especially looking at theater shows, which I've done a fair amount of, you may not have the headroom to be able to play back that many Notch LC cues at once. And so we have our folders in here. We can drop individual files into it. This folder structure I maintain is mainly due to if you're going to use auto-populate for Sock Puppet, or if you're going to use a lighting console to control D3. Auto-populate means that you can go into bank 1, slot 1, and access the video that is in 001. But with that being said, let's go ahead and let's actually fire up a project and take a look at the interface itself. I realized I was only showing D3 during that section. So the D3 project folder lives in my documents folder currently, or on the D drive on any of your actual servers. We're working with chet today. You can see some of these other projects I've worked on recently. Inside that folder, we have the project file, the history folder, the objects folder. History is just a list of the various history files saved every 5 minutes. And objects has video files, meshes for the 3 meshes we'll use, audio files if we're going to play back audio, as well as some other things that we won't get into for a while, LUT files, Notch files. DX texture is still images being used just for texturing now. So, like I said earlier, let's go ahead and looking at D3 Manager, I'm just going to go ahead and start up our project. I'm running the project, it's not allowed to go full screen, which is how I'm able to share this with you. If I was not running windowed mode, you would actually not see anything that comes up. You just see a black screen, which is basically what I just did for the file structure part of the lecture. So this is the standard D3 interface. We have the timeline down here on the bottom, which is where we'll do all of our sequencing. Up here in the center is our 3D workspace, or our stage as we call it. And over here in the feed is where we're going to patch our outputs for when we output into the real world. I think of each of these as a layer of abstraction, which is kind of a complicated way to talk about it. But what I mean with a layer of abstraction is that I can make changes here in the timeline or here on the stage without affecting either one. if I move my screens around or my projectors, I'm not going to affect my patch that I've made in the feed. There's ways to adjust individual pieces from the timeline, but we will get into that as a more complicated workflow in an additional class. Over here, this is our 3D widget, which basically allows us to maneuver objects by grabbing handles. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because I would prefer to control everything through numbers, just so it drops out at exactly, say, 3 meters, not 3 meters and 5 nanometers. As far as maneuvering around the 3D world, I can left-click and drag on an object to rotate around it. I can use my mouse wheel to scroll in and out, or right-click and drag to move in and out. If I hold the Tab key, I can dolly around my window, or do the same thing by using the middle mouse click. If I want to save some bookmarks of different locations, I can use that by recording holding the Alt key and pushing, say, F2 to record a bookmark. Seems like that's been taken over by Windows. So we'll record it this way. I can store a bookmark to the front, to the side, to the top, and then let's record a nice view way off to the side here. So now I can recall these by using my F keys. I can name them here in the Bookmarks window. So now, when I recall a bookmark, it recalls that name. That bookmark window is either Control B, or if we right-click on Stage, down under Cameras, Camera Bookmark List will give that to us. So that's just a basic introduction of how we navigate around the stage. I'm going to focus on the timeline for a bit so that we can start getting some media and get ready to populate that. So the timeline down here is in hours, minutes, seconds, frames. By default, it's set to be at 30 FPS, but we can adjust that by going into project settings and changing our global refresh rate. We could set a base rate here that's custom, select NTSC based or 50. I'm going to leave it at 60. 60 is what I do a majority of my projects in. You'll see 50 a lot more in Europe due to how Europe is set up. 50 hertz power versus 60 and all of that. This is the timeline itself. It gives us a nice call out for wherever our playhead is. I use splits on the timeline as a way of organizing myself. A split is either created by clicking where we want, right-clicking and choosing to split section, or using the shortcut Alt-S. Basically, that's just going to give us an option of where cues happen. When it comes to playing a video in D3, for instance, this orbiting galaxy, basically everything in D3 is essentially free run. That video will continue playing for as long as I want it to. And the reason that I'll put a section break there is because at the end of the section, I'll want the video to, say, fade out over 5 seconds. So now that playhead can be moving for as long as I want until we take the go, like now. And we have a smooth fade to dark. For those of us who use watchout, think of D3 as if it is every video in free run mode in watchout. The section breaks are kind of equivalent to pause tweens, but are a little bit more powerful and easy to work with. One of the big advantages that we have here is the fact that there's keyboard shortcuts to get between them, as well as just buttons here that we can push. Those keyboard shortcuts are comma and period to go back and forth respectively. If you look at your keyboard, that's actually open bracket and close bracket, or arrows pointing in opposite directions. And so imagine that when we push that arrow key, for instance, this is comma that takes us back to the start. It moves us back a section. Down here we have our control buttons. This is the normal play, played end of section, hold, and loop section. When I'm doing a show in D3, I very rarely use the play to end of, or the play mode here, or the loop section. I do almost everything in the play to end of section hold, because that means that when we hit our section break here, we will just hold and continue playing videos for as long as necessary. Previous, next, this will take us back to the top of the track. And this will allow us to switch between previous track and next track. And this is for device recording. If I want to record, say, automation data or MIDI data to my timeline to sequence back to. I've already made one layer, which is this video layer. Making a layer requires us to either right-click where we want the layer to be, give the layer a name, and hit enter. And then we can choose the layer from our selection of layers. Video is going to be for video playback. I also use it for still image playback because in the end it uses the same playback engine. Control layers can be very helpful for various pieces. I use control a lot for, say, controlling the dowsers of a projector, or sometimes I'll use DMX control for that same thing. Effects are various effects that we can pipe our video in and adjust it with. For instance, if I want to put, say, a blur layer in, I can Alt and drag and now adjust the radius of the blur. But let's go ahead and let's just sequence in a second video. The keyboard shortcut to get to video layers is Control L. It will bring up this window. Notice it will auto-name your video based off of, or auto-name your layer based off of the layer type you choose. So if we choose, say, a motion blur layer, it will give us a motion blur. If we make a second, it'll give us motion blur too. So now we have a split crossfade. I'm just going to go ahead and put, say, the faces video on this so that we've now sequenced a quick transition between the two. This is one way that we can go about our transitions. The other way we can do it is through a process called universal crossfade. Universal crossfade makes for a very fast way of fading out between looks. So if I want to use a universal crossfade, I can click here in this section, and under crossfade, I can give it a time for its crossfade to happen in. In this case, we are going from a state of having the face video playing to a state of nothing. So if my playhead's moving, and I take my next cue, go, we now have a quick 5-second out. You have to be a little bit careful with universal crossfade because you are loading two instances of the timeline on top of one another when that happens. For something like this, it's not a big worry because I am not playing back much content. But if you have a very heavy show, you'll notice that you'll drop frames during universal crossfade, especially if you have a lot of notch work going on, which is why I suggest avoiding it at times. It's also nice to be able to control the down and the up time separately, which is what we're doing here. We have 3 seconds up on this, while at the same time we are fading the video behind it down over 5 seconds. So the video behind it will be a little less present than it would normally be. And now at this moment, it's been completely overtaken by the fade in of that. So it's a really quick introduction to some of the sequencing pieces. Looking more in depth in the layers, we have a large number of options, which we're not going to go through each and every one, but let's talk about some that are very useful. This opacity is the transparency of the video, or when we're in an alpha blend mode, the brightness. It allows us to fade in the video over however much amount of time, or adjust the relative brightness at the end of it. You can see we're only at a 0.63 opacity at this moment, which is a little darker. It means that we could actually have this running under it the whole time if we want to drop this down to say like a 0.15. We're compositing these two together. This is using an alpha blend mode. There's a variety of options that we can choose for blend modes inside Disguise. Alpha I use really commonly. I also like having the ability to just do an added blend mode, which brightens the pixels a little bit and leaves it transparent on the background. Screen is another very useful one, especially if you have, say, white text over a black background. You can use that to screen on top and then have the video reveal whatever behind it. The type of keyframing that we're working with in blend modes is what we refer to as option keyframe. Option is selected from a menu. You're not creating new blend modes throughout the show. You have a pre-selected coded number of blend modes that we can work with. Also, when we switch between blend modes, currently we're in alpha. If we switch to multiply here, and notice how it gets much darker because it's only where we have pixels. And then switch this to over. Now we cannot see the video behind it at all. As we play through that, notice it snaps to the various blend modes. There's a reasoning for that, and that reasoning has to do with the fact that you can't fade between blend modes. It's basically a 0-1 selection. Hint, this is an option keyframe. You choose options. The video that we have itself is an object keyframe. So currently we have the particle faces, but I could replace this with, say, the test balls instead. So now when we play back, bring up this ball video instead. And note that all we did was replace the video. All the other keyframing that we've done remains part of it. We can adjust the speed of the video. Normal mode is what I leave things in most of the time, unless I want to lock it to timecode, in which case I'll switch that video to be locked. And the big difference that we'll notice with locked versus normal, as I'm playing here in the galaxy, note when I click around, the video keeps playing through. Same how as I'm held at the end of the section, the video keeps looping. Compare that with the behavior that we get once we switch to this locked video. as I hop around, we pop to various keyframes inside it. And as we hold at the end of the section, we actually pause. So that's useful if you're doing a concert and want to have the video playback the entire length. But when I want something looping as a background, I'll leave it in normal. So let's go ahead and let's actually set this back to normal. At the end point, you can loop it, you can pause it, or you can have it play in reverse if necessary. Audio playback if you have audio embedded in the video. Color shiftability, brightness, contrast, saturation, and hue shift. If you're going to key out something, you can bring in a video that's recorded on a green screen and actually key out that piece. Move and crop are two that I use a lot now. Move allows me to resize the videos. And let's just go a little bit in here. So if I hold Control, I can roll up and down the size of the video by just changing the size. Or I can stretch the scale X or the scale Y if I want to adjust it only in one axis. Adjusting the position will move it left, right, or up and down. And rotation will rotate it around its center axis here. The crop allows us to barn door off sides. So I can bring in the barn door here or on the right. But that gets really interesting when we combine it with the vignette itself. So the vignette is, and let me give something that's full the entire way around. So the vignette is, as we can see, vignetting around the edge of the video itself. I can take that length very high or have it rolled out. If I change these so that my minimum is actually -1, I can adjust how that vignette looks. And actually, this should be a note for D3 that they should make the minimum for this default to -1. Because if I say, take my top crop and start rolling it out, what happens is I basically adjusted the vignette, rather than starting at the end, is now pushing out past the end so that we feather not the entire video itself. I've been doing a lot of crop work in recent shows. I realize we don't cover it super well. Adam missed like half an hour. I'm really sorry, Adam. This is recorded for posterity, though. So this is all well and good to see how we sequence on one screen, but let's take it a step further and give ourselves a couple screens to work with. I'm going to use the default D3 training setup, which is essentially one screen center hero screen, which is this one at 1920 1080, and then we'll do two smaller iMag screens off to the side. So if I want to add a new screen, right-click on Stage. And so we worked with cameras before. Now we have LED screens, DMX screens and DMX lights, projection surfaces, and projectors. Let's look at LED screens. So I can toggle this down and click the plus sign to create a new LED screen. LED left, which gives us a screen. It's currently located at offset 000, the very center of the project, our origin, with no rotation, a scale of 111, and resolution 256. So what are we saying with that? Well, it's located at the origin point with no rotation. We covered that before. The scale is what's interesting about it. This 1:1 scale, this rectangle itself is one of the built-in D3 rectangles. It's actually built in Blender to have, or in whatever 3D software package you're working in, to have 1 unit by 1 unit. Everything in D3 is thought of in meters. So in this case, we have a screen that's going to be 1 meter by 1 meter. If I want to make it larger, I can make it, say, 4 by 3 meters. I can also adjust its offset by either clicking and moving in it or typing in numbers. I can set the resolution of the screen, because one thing that's problematic about this right now is we're set to be a 4 by 3 aspect ratio, but the screen itself is a resolution of 256 by 256, which means that our pixels are going to be rectangular, which is not anything that we normally want. So I'm going to set this to be 512 by 384, which is a standard very low resolution 4 by 3 aspect ratio. But now we have one screen on our left rather. If we think about it this way. And let's go ahead and let's duplicate this to make LED right. Gave it an offset of -8 since everything is basically mirroring around the center. And now we have 3 screens. But we don't have content on these screens, and we need to discuss how exactly one goes about giving those screens content. So I talked about the abstract layers before. We've got our timeline, our 3D world, and our feed, which we know as our feed has added LED left and LED right now, because these are new output sources from our stage. So to apply content from our timeline onto any of our objects, we're going to use something called mappings. And mappings are a way of addressing content to our 3D world or to the 2D pixel space of the objects. I'm going to go ahead and make a new track. A track is a timeline. Currently we're working in the default track 1. I'm going to make a new track called mappings. I rather dogmatically burn the first 30 seconds of every track I make. That way, whenever I hop into a track, nothing flashes up on screen. It's kind of a safety for myself just to be careful. So the first thing we're going to do is I'll put another video layer on. Let's make it only 30 seconds long. Put a section break after it. And let's go ahead and let's use, say, the street test as a video. And you'll notice it popped on to LED right to start out with. The reason that that happened is because it's defaulting its mapping. So let's make a new mapping, which we're going to call all direct. You can see here are the 7 types of mappings default in D3. There are some more advanced ones that are available in labs. We won't go into that probably anytime in the near future, but there's a couple that have been very useful to me in the past. But these mappings really break up into 2 major types. The first type, direct mapping, feed mapping, are direct to the UV of the object. And we'll explain that after we make a direct mapping and a feed mapping. The other ones are 3D mappings or geometric mappings. So we're going to make a new direct mapping. And we're going to add in the screens, LED left, LED right, and surface 1. Surface 1 is the surface for the projector. We don't want to direct map to the projector itself, because that doesn't do us much good. But now you can see we have that same video playing across all 3 screens. I also have under the mappings LED left, LED right, and surface 1 as individual mappings. So if I wanted to, I could make 3 video layers. Set that to LED left, set that to LED right, and for video, Let's do the galaxy on that one. And let's do the balls on that one. So now I have them addressed to the 3 different ones. You'll notice that even though video at the bottom is mapped to all 3, we only see it on the center screen. And the reasoning behind that is because D3 is stacking in a top-bottom blend order. So whatever's on the very top, in this case, the galaxy, is on top of all these others. Because we've only mapped 2 videos to the screen, it just overrides that. If we drop this down to a half opacity, we can see through to the other one. But that's direct mapping, direct to the UV of the object. I'm just going to leave us with the same object in all 3. The next mapping we're going to look at is called a feed mapping. And a feed mapping is very similar to the direct mapping. But this time, we can work with this 2D space to basically take our input and put it across our screens as outputs. So I need a video to work with. I actually have this disguised training template that I made back in the day, which will be our content for the feed mapping. So now we can see there's our content on top. We have to assign screens to the mapping. So we'll drop in LED left, surface 1, LED right. We have our individual outputs at their relative size. This is only 512 by 384 pixels, as opposed to this, which is 1920 x 1080. Note how we're not seeing all of the video. That's because the video itself is 3000 by 1200 pixels. But the mapping is currently set to be 720 by 576. So let's set this to be 3000 by 1200. And now we can see the whole piece of it. So basically, these are going to work as windows onto this object. So if I add a feed rectangle here, I'm now looking through wherever this rectangle has been placed on the screen and placing it here. Obviously, this doesn't look quite right. So let's go a little bit closer into this mapping and see what we're doing. So for the projection center, we want it to be at 100 by 100 pixels. As I maneuver this around, you can see those numbers changing. Basically, imagine this top left corner is 0, 0. As we go to our right, it increases in number on the x-axis. As we go down, it increases in the y-axis. I know it wants me at 100, 100, so I can actually type that in. And now I'm sampling pixel perfectly off of that content template. I can add LED right, which is down here at, if we zoom in, 2100 by 600. I can add LED left. And notice how they just snap in together. So you can see LED right, LED right, LED left, LED left. All of this is lined up as it's supposed to be. Why is this useful? Well, this is very useful for creating content templates. Now, if I provide this Photoshop document, or if it's an After Effects project, I provide this file to whoever is working on the project, and they know exactly where every pixel will show up. If they place a pixel, say right here on LED right, it's going to show up exactly here. I said that there's 2 types of mapping, direct to UV and geometric before. And the reason why is look what happens if I move LED right around. it maintains its content. It's basically pasted to that object. So the third type of mapping we'll work with is going to be all para, a parallel mapping. So now, as opposed to working with a mapping that's direct to these individual objects, what we're going to do is create basically a bounding rectangle that is going to encompass these screens. They receive whatever content is moving through that area. So, as we do with all mappings, I'm going to add my screens. LED left, LED right, surface 1. And I'm going to turn off this lock on the aspect ratio as I put in my resolution. 1920, 1080. I'm going to set its size to be 8 by 4.5. 1920, 1080 is a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. 8 by 4.5 is 16 by 9 divided by 2. So now our pixels are again square, which is what we're wanting. Once I've put that in, I'm going to lock it back to the aspect ratio. And so we've created this bounding box here. Currently, it's the exact same size as surface 1. If I close out and play this, you can see it's just playing on the very bottom of surface 1, which is super not useful. So let's make it into something more useful. I have this positioning that I can adjust. So that's going to be the first thing I do, is pull it back just so I can see this bounding box a little bit separate from everything else. So we're going to want the position to be higher. Since all of these are 3 meters in the air, I'm going to go ahead and set that to be 3 meter. And now I made this 8 by 4.5, but because I'm locked to the aspect ratio, I can actually just start rolling this up. And it will adjust both the height and the width at the same speed. So it maintains that aspect ratio. It's like it's locked to it or something. So currently, we're still not quite big enough to catch any of LED right or LED left. They're bright red to tell you that they're part of this mapping, but not actually being encompassed by the mapping as you're editing it. So I'm just going to keep rolling up until we cover all of it. And now what we have is a parallel mapping so that the objects carry on across all of it. Let's switch this to, say, the orbiting galaxy so that we have more continuous lines to work with. It's respecting the distance between them. Note specifically this line here that continues across all the screens. Where the big difference between a geometric mapping and a direct to UV mapping comes in is right here. Because if I click into LED left and start moving it, I'm moving that screen through the mapping. So it ends up receiving whatever part of the mapping it needs to. When we talk about automation on Wednesday, that will be really important. We can move any of these screens, and as long as they stay within the mapping, they'll receive the content. But as we go above it, you can see that line of it no longer being in the content itself. So you may have noticed as I was moving it around that suddenly, even though we're no longer in the cone of projector 1, which is projecting on surface 1, we still have content. And you may be wondering, why is that happening? So what we're doing with content in disguise and projection surfaces versus projectors is we actually apply the content directly to the surface itself, rather than think about content from the point of view of the projector, which means that if our projector has to move, say for instance, rather than being this straight on angle, the projector itself is over here, our content would have to readjust if we had based our projector content on that point of view of the projector. So we'll put this in and we'll see in our feed, this is what the projector is outputting there. And as we move the projector back towards center, notice how it's adjusting the content to deal with that. Think of our projectors not as projectors. Think of them as a camera. That camera is located at, in this case, right here. And it's outputting whatever it can see. In this case, it basically sees the entirety of that screen. If that projection surface starts changing its position on the X, you can see how it would project less or more of it. And if we look in the feed at projector 1, we can see the same thing as well. The screen gets further away, more of the projection raster is thrown away, it just projects this smaller amount. Because of this, working with projectors in D3, when you get to the real world, you have to have a process of basically teaching the projectors what their relationship is in the 3D world. That's done through a process called QuickCal primarily. Sometimes we'll use OmniCal, the camera calibration method, or Blacktrack's calibration if you happen to be working with Blacktracks. I unfortunately can't really demonstrate that. I don't happen to have projectors at home. So we will discuss that at a further point once I figure out a good way of handling that. Hello from India. Hi, I'm in Astoria. So this is where we patch our outputs. I'm going to go ahead and change what we have for computers. In this case, I'm going to make a new machine, which will be my master machine. We'll make its type A solo. And I'll add an output machine. Which will be, say, a 2x4. So, the master is going to control the D3 session. It's going to be the computer that is receiving information from, say, lighting to trigger various cues, receiving information from automation to move screens about, giving you this 3D world that we've been looking at in the stage view this whole time. I don't necessarily like to have my master computer output. You can for smaller shows, but because it's doing so many other things, it can be a bit problematic. Instead, I'm going to use it as what's referred to as a pure master, a master that's just dealing with the 3D world, dealing with previs. And then as far as our output machine, I use the 2x4, which is a 2 VFC card box, meaning I'm doing 2 4Ks worth of output, which I can then subdivide. In this case, we have a quad DVI card selected, so it will subdivide that 4K output into 4 DVI outputs. I can go ahead and just patch these to those individual outputs. And now if I plug that in and send it out to, say, projector or send it out to the LED processor, it should just go out in the real world. Note I patched the projector, not the surface, tying back to that whole conversation we had earlier. At this point, the show would be ready to go ahead and take on site, and we can output our 3 very, very wonderful, quickly made cues. I'm going to go ahead and rather than continuing to dive into this, I'm going to say that this is the end of today's lecture. I have a couple other classes planned coming up later. Next Wednesday, so in 2 days at noon again, noonish, because apparently I break live streams half the time I try and do it. we will switch over and do a class on automation in D3. So we'll look at creating an automation device through the devices list and using Creative Connor's spike mark to place objects into it and to track those objects. Creative Connors luckily will output directly to D3 using a process called PosiStageNet, which is kind of the de facto standard for tracking now, which was put together by VYV and GrandMA and is frankly a massively important tool in the industry. Great. Are there any questions so far? I'm keeping an eye on the chat. I have it pulled up on... This entire process is a little ridiculous. Currently, we have my MacBook Pro running just YouTube so I can make sure that everything is actually still playing properly, and so I can see what the chat is actually saying. Over here, I have my Surface Book, which is actually running D3, and then I have my primary monitor in front. So, any questions about what we've gone over? Anything people want to see more of? Want to see less of? And basically, I'm doing this partially to keep myself sane, but it's also nice to kind of have communication with everyone. So I'm just going to pause for a moment while I read the chat and see if anything comes up. I will say one thing about this whole quarantine thing. I've stayed more hydrated than anything else. So Alex is asking about cues being in the timeline almost arbitrary. And in some ways, yes, very much so. If you're used to thinking of cues in, say, a queue stack form from something like QLab or from Disguise. Okay, he's asking if you want to sync up audio with D3, does the timeline directly correspond to any timecode information? So let me pop back into D3. And we'll go to, we'll actually make a new track for timecode. I'll split the section, and then I'm going to put a timecode tag in. Tags are how cues work in Disguise. In this case, I'll set my tag to be at 1 hour, 30 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 frames. So look at what happened to my timeline once I did that. Now we're at 1 hour, 30 minutes, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds. So if I want to jam my video to timecode, basically everything is set up for that to happen now. I would just need to, in my transport, which transport is outside control of D3, I just set it to be an LTC timecode, choose what I'm using for my line in for it, which I don't have anything coming in currently. But then I could jam to timecode that way. Let's actually switch to the timecode tester, which will we'll set our start time to be 1 hour. Wow. 1 hour, 29 minutes, and 50 seconds. So I can reset this, engage my timecode. I'm actually going to go, let's go on stage, and I'm going to go to a different mapping entirely. So if I start this running, currently we're at no matching timecode. once I get to that, we can see we're pre-rolling our time code. And then once we hit 1 hour, 30 minutes, we snap to that point. So now we're jamming time code along with sound. If they wanted to hop the time code, say, move us forward, I can skip it forward and you can see my time code popping along with it. So that would be, if I want to jam time code, that's how I do it. And in that case, I would sequence that whole section to be as long as the time code needs to be, as opposed to my more arbitrary choice of, we can stop that now. My more arbitrary choice of every 30 seconds, which is mostly just because it's cleaner and it gives me enough space to sequence in. Does that make sense, Alex? Rob is asking for workflows for modeling UVs for import into Disguise, which is a really great workflow and a good thing to ask. And actually, this is a perfect time to shout out a couple other people who are doing things, which should actually be linked in the... If you show more on the video on YouTube, I put some links in. Unfortunately, the person who's going to do this lecture on, I believe, Friday, Rich Porter, who is a wonderful D3 programmer and even better human being, will be going through some of that process and might actually be very, very helpful. I highly suggest that. I will also do one as well. I want to give a little bit of time so that Rich's can shine, and then I'll do my own take on it, showing, because I assume we'll have different workflows on it. But yeah, I'll definitely add that to the log of classes to teach. Thanks, Rob. I hope Chicago is good and not quite as crazy as it is here. For those of us who are geeky and own a Streamdeck, I'm actually using my Streamdeck for the first time actually for streaming and not for everything else, which is kind of exciting, to be perfectly honest. It's been interesting learning this whole process, as you can tell from the start, where things just kind of didn't work for about 5 minutes. Are there any other questions? Also, this like 15-second delay is killing me. Yeah, I'll ask a question and then just have to vamp for a bit as I wait to see if anyone responds. My vamping is really, really bad. I should make some type of Ableton loop that I can trigger that just plays hold music. Oh, Beth asked what my background is. That's a picture that I just had laying around my computer. Up there is actually Shiprock, which is the inner core of a volcano out in my home area. I was trying to find something that I thought would be very interesting. We actually used this on an online RPG we were playing for a while as the background that the board sat on, and I thought, oh, this is really pretty. And to be quite frank about it, I'm more than a little bit homesick and not sure the next chance I'll get to go home, because the whole I don't want to infect my parents. So this seemed like a good way of kind of remembering my roots. All right, well, if you look down at the bottom of the YouTube video, we have some other links to Graham, Shannon, and Andy's individual YouTube channels. Graham has put up some really interesting stuff about using Isadora and D3 together. and has one coming up of using Isadora's interactive effects and piping into D3, which I'm really excited for. Shannon's been doing some really exciting stuff about workflows of between D3 notch, Cinema 4D, and Andy's just brilliant. I'm very excited for his first talk, which should be coming up on Wednesday. I also put a link to Disguise is running the full fundamentals training. If you'd rather do Disguise, if you'd rather learn Disguise from Disguise, that will be Tuesday and Thursday, basically taking up most of the day in 1 hour blocks. My next class will be on Wednesday, and it's going to be on automation, as I mentioned a couple times. As far as other software I work on, Disguise is my primary programming platform. I also work in Watchout, QLab, Isadora. I do QLab for both audio and video, and I used it for lighting for the first time, tinkering around for actually dowser control of the new Epsons, which was an experience and worked out very well. Had a lot of help from Ido Levren and Anya Haas, who are both programmers local to the city. I also do work in Blender. I'm starting to teach myself Unreal because it seems like I have some free time on my hands. I do some work in Blacktracks as far as tracking goes. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's really important to cover. Audio work, I really like Logic if I'm composing. Frankly, I'm still kind of using the open source movement and use Audacity for quick edits because I really like the whole open source philosophy. But yeah, thank you all for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Monday. I'm going to go finish the pot of coffee. Do love me a good watch out show. Take care all and have a terrific day. Let's see if